I knew the air had shifted when I walked into the server room and found 3 empty chairs and a post-it note that just said, "Let go, sorry." My team, Cal, Denise, and Bobby, gone. No heads up, no transition docs, just erased. They were the ones who stayed late without being asked, the ones who pulled 3-day rotations during the 2023 regulatory freeze without a word of complaint. And now their desks were cleared like they'd never mattered, like we were running a vending machine, not critical defense communications. I stood there, phone still in my hand, heartbeat in my ears, and stared at those abandoned monitors still humming with unfinished logs. That's when I knew Darren Huxley was going to be a problem. Quick pause before we dive deeper. If you're listening, odds are you're one of the 97% who hasn't hit subscribe yet. It takes 2 seconds, costs nothing, and really helps our team keep these stories coming. A like goes even further. All right, back to the disaster at hand. See, Calvin and I, we weren't friends, not exactly. But we trusted each other. I didn't need pep talks or morning check-ins. He didn't need daily reports. He knew if the systems were quiet, I was doing my job. If they weren't, I was already fixing them. I'd earned that autonomy with 9 years of uninterrupted service, 3 internal security commendations, and a stack of federal audit passes thicker than Darren's entire resume. So when Calvin left for his first vacation in a decade, he made it clear, "You have operational discretion. You answer to no one but me. Keep it steady." That lasted exactly 72 hours. Darren showed up on Monday morning with the unearned swagger of a man who once successfully pitched a rebrand and thought it made him Moses parting the Red Sea. Tan from whatever conference golf resort hybrid he'd just crawled out of. Aviator sunglasses tucked into the front of his pastel shirt like he was about to shoot a car commercial. His handshake lingered a little too long when he introduced himself to me. "So you're the infamous Julia," he said with a smirk. "The last holdout of the old guard. We'll have to fix that." He laughed like it was a joke. I didn't. That first week, he didn't ask a single question about operations. Not one. Didn't shadow a call, didn't review a dashboard, didn't even tour the vaults. He started each morning in the boardroom with loud espresso orders and louder opinions, and spent afternoons reassigning office spaces to people based on cross-functional synergy and brand cohesion. I spent that same week quietly moving critical backups off shared drives, just in case. Not sabotage, just insurance. I'd seen men like Darren before. They didn't understand what they were breaking until it cost someone else millions. Then came day 3. I came in at 7:12 a.m. the way I always did, and found the service ticket board wiped clean. Not just cleared, deleted. Entire backlog gone. I pinged Denise. No reply. Bobby? No reply. Cal? His badge had already been revoked. I sprinted to HR. Effective immediately, the HR manager said, eyes not meeting mine, per interim leadership direction. Why? I asked. She shrugged. Realignment, flattening, new phase. New phase. Like these people were furniture being redecorated, not systems lifelines. That night, I stayed until nearly 11, backing up every config file, access log, and architecture diagram I could legally touch. I wasn't planning revenge. I was documenting lineage. If the plane was going to crash, someone had to leave a black box behind. By Friday, I was still standing. Darren hadn't touched me yet. I figured he assumed I'd either quit in protest or roll over like the rest. What he didn't realize was that I'd already been through worse. Budget crises, vendor breaches, internal mutinies. I survived them all because I never blinked first. And I wasn't about to start now. But he was circling, calling my work opaque, scheduling meetings without me, dropping buzzwords like redundancy optimization in rooms full of marketers who nodded like they understood. I knew what was coming. But what Darren didn't know was that Calvin had given me more than trust. He'd given me teeth, and if Darren wanted to start swinging before reading the fine print, I wasn't going to stop him. I just opened the folder labeled Clause 19C and let the wreckage unfold on its own. He waited until the Monday stand-up to make it personal. Not subtle, not smart, just loud enough to humiliate and quiet enough to avoid consequences. "We've identified bottlenecks," Darren said, pacing in front of the wall-sized dashboard like a game show host who'd just learned the word throughput. Specifically in infrastructure legacy control, we'll be sunsetting redundant systems to empower leaner architecture. The screen behind him flashed a bulleted list. My work, my framework, my initials in brackets beside tags I'd written over 6 years ago. And right under that, legacy architecture to be phased out. Owner, JC. People turned and looked at me. I didn't blink, didn't move, just nodded once and wrote two things in my notebook: public cut and timestamp, 09:12 a.m. Then came the real knife twist. After the meeting, while everyone filed out looking dazed or grateful they hadn't been the day's sacrifice, Darren cornered me by the espresso machine like we were equals. Or worse, like he was teaching me something. "You should take a break," he said, tone syrupy. I looked at him flatly. "A break?" "Or a hint," he said, smiling like a man who thought HR would back him no matter what. "No shame in stepping aside gracefully. These systems, they don't scale anymore." I wanted to laugh. The only reason Stratanel's military platforms hadn't buckled under 2 consecutive 0-day threats and a 12-day vendor strike was because my legacy code included fail-safes no one else even knew how to access. They didn't scale because they didn't need to. They stabilized. He leaned closer. "You're smart, Julia, but this company's changing. Don't get caught clinging to the past." I let the silence linger just long enough to make him uncomfortable, then said, "Is this temporary?" He tilted his head like I was a confused child. "Your director's gone. I'm in charge now. You report to me." Then he walked away, already messaging his assistant to schedule something asinine like culture realignment. I stood there a second longer, then went back to my desk, sat down, and pulled out the physical copy of my employment contract I kept in my drawer. Not paranoia, just pattern recognition. I flipped to the end. Schedule D, Clause 19C. Highlighted in pale yellow from the day I signed it. In the event of executive termination without cause during interim management, all severance and retention clauses shall apply as if under hostile restructure. This includes equity acceleration, bonus continuation, and optional release from non-compete agreements as defined under Section 14. A clause nobody remembered, except me, because I'd asked for it. Quietly, politely. Right after the merger that gutted our sister division 5 years ago, Calvin had signed off without a second glance. Standard retention language, I'd said, and it was. Technically, but also not. I reread it twice that night, just to be sure. Then I checked the definition of executive termination. It applied to dismissals without cause. It applied to forced resignations. It applied to structural elimination under interim leadership. And it most definitely applied to being publicly demoted, strategically frozen out, and shoved toward the exit by a man with a title he'd borrowed for 3 weeks. He thought he was flexing power. What he was doing was triggering mine. I closed the contract, opened a clean folder on my desktop, and labeled it, "If Then." Inside, I started placing files, backups of my frameworks. Screenshots of the all-hands slides, a screen recording of the dashboard showing the legacy deprecation list, time-stamped, his post-meeting message to his assistant, which he'd accidentally CC'd to me because my initials autofilled next to Jeremy Charles in Outlook, and finally a simple note: when he acts, do not resist, just document, because you don't stop someone mid-self-destruction. You just step back and give them the space to detonate. The glass walls made it worse. People walked by pretending not to look, but I could see the reflection of every stolen glance. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than Darren's voice, which had all the gravity of a parking ticket. He didn't sit, just stood at the end of the table, one hand resting theatrically on a glossy folder labeled Personnel Transition. I remember the smell of his cologne, too sharp, too forced, like he was trying to radiate control but had bought it off a shelf at Macy's. "You're being let go," he said, smooth as an ad read. "Effective immediately." He slid the folder toward me like he was handing over a check at a charity gala. No eye contact, no preamble, just a decision wrapped in polished ego. "Calvin's aware?" I asked, voice level. Darren gave that smirk he'd mastered in the mirror, the one that assumed victory. "He trusts my judgment." I looked down at the folder, already pre-signed. Time-stamped 7:42 a.m., notarized. Either he'd planned this days ago or he'd woken up early just to be HR to their own paperwork. He must have felt proud, like he'd cut out a tumor no one else had the guts to touch. I slid the papers back toward him. "You're sure you want to proceed without legal review?" His hand hovered over the folder like he was shielding it from logic. "Legal's slow," he said. "This is done." Then he walked around to the door like he expected me to follow him out of the building in some quiet act of defeated dignity, the way quiet women are supposed to, the way women with operational knowledge aren't. I didn't move. Instead, I leaned forward, tapped the folder once, and said, "Then I'll need a printout for my records." He blinked. "The original's right there." "I want the one with your timestamp," I replied. "The actual termination directive. Signed." That threw him, but only for a second. "I'll have Janice print it," he muttered, already backpedaling toward his assistant's desk. I left the glass coffin of that conference room with nothing but my phone, my badge, and a perfectly legal, fully documented confirmation of his recklessness. Janice handed me the printout without a word. I caught the edge of hesitation in her eyes. Just a flicker. She knew. She didn't know what she knew, but she knew enough to not say anything. Smart. I didn't pack my things. I'd already moved anything important to cloud storage weeks ago. I didn't log out of Slack or Teams. No, "it's been an honor" farewell post. No tears, no passive-aggressive email chain. I just walked past the security guard, handed over my badge, and smiled when he said, "You were always one of the good ones." Outside, the sky was bright and cold. The kind of morning that looked cleaner than it felt. I stood under the overhang for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle. Not sadness, not shock, just calibration. They'd fired me, not under review, not on performance grounds, just gone. And because Darren had done it under interim authority, without cause, without HR mediation, and without executive confirmation, he'd flipped the switch buried at the bottom of a contract he never bothered to read. Clause 19C. My severance would trigger like a pressure plate. Equity acceleration, retention bonuses, and, if legal held up, full release from my non-compete agreement. All because Darren wanted to swing power like a golf club while the real adults were out of town. I walked to my car, folded the termination notice in half, and slipped it behind the visor. Then I opened my notes app and typed 3 words. He lit it. I didn't need to argue, didn't need to warn anyone. All I had to do was wait for the fuse to reach the charge. The first clue that things had shifted was the silence. Not the usual Monday hum of Slack pings and keyboard taps, but a different kind of hush, like the building itself was holding its breath. At 9:46 a.m. sharp, Calvin Briggs stepped off the executive elevator. No tan from Greece, no smile, no "how was the team" pleasantries. Just a navy suit, gray eyes, and the kind of posture that said someone was about to bleed metaphorically. He didn't take the long way through the main floor, didn't make his rounds. He walked straight past reception, turned the corner, and made a beeline for Darren's office. I wasn't there to see it. Physically anyway, but I knew the layout: glass walls, mid-century desk, little bonsai plant someone from HR gave Darren when he took interim leadership like it was a coronation. Calvin walked in, didn't knock. The door didn't shut, it slammed. 2 floors down, a friend in finance texted me, "He's back and he's not smiling." 15 minutes passed, then a company-wide email landed in every inbox. Subject: immediate operational freeze. Terminations and personnel restructure. From Human Resources, Central Compliance. All pending or recent terminations are to be reviewed. Effective immediately, a hold is placed on all personnel adjustments enacted during interim management. No exceptions. The timestamp? 10:01 a.m. I blinked once, then twice, then smiled. At 10:03, a second email arrived, this time just for me, from corporate legal. Subject: employment status update. Contractual activation, Schedule D. Your removal during interim management has activated Clause 19C. Retention payout and equity acceleration now in effect. No action needed on your part. Documentation forthcoming. Please reach out only if contact is required. That was it. No apology, no backpedaling. Just confirmation. Cold, clinical, absolute. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a metronome on the edge of Vindication. Clause 19C, the one nobody read, the one I negotiated 5 years ago when our last acquisition gutted half of legal and turned onboarding into a minefield of ambiguity. I had slipped it in with the help of a compliance consultant who now worked at a defense contractor, ironically the same one I'd soon be consulting for. It wasn't a trick clause, it wasn't buried under legalese or hidden in a footnote. It was right there in black and white. In the event of non-performance-based termination under interim management, the employee shall be treated as severed due to structural reorganization, with all associated retention, equity, equity, and bonus clauses activated. Darren hadn't just fired me, he detonated the equivalent of a golden parachute with a reinforced legal exoskeleton. And the best part? It was irrevocable. Calvin couldn't undo it. HR couldn't reframe it. Legal had already processed the trigger. There was no walk back or reassignment to soften the blow. Darren had pulled the pin and tossed the grenade, and Clause 19C had exploded in the middle of his career. By 10:30 a.m., I was getting calls I didn't answer. Slack DMs from old teammates. Are you coming back? What happened? Why is Darren ghosting everyone? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I ordered coffee, opened my laptop, reviewed the email again. No action needed on your part. Because sometimes, power isn't in what you do. It's in what they've already done. The voicemail came in at 11:12 a.m. Not a call. A voicemail. That alone told me Darren was unraveling. There's been some confusion, he began, in the smooth, polished voice of a man trying to sound like he hadn't spent the last week lighting his own credibility on fire. I'd like to offer reinstatement under a different title, maybe Strategic Systems Liaison. We can discuss compensation. Just, let's talk. He didn't say the word mistake, didn't say sorry, just the classic PR-grade phrases of someone hoping to patch drywall after driving a forklift through the wall. I let the message play once, then again. Then I saved it and dragged it into a folder labeled post-detonation. I didn't return his call. I didn't have to. By that point, the company-wide freeze had escalated to a formal compliance review. HR had updated their case file with one critical line I knew would break Darren's entire walkback strategy, filed as unilateral termination under temporary authority, permanent classification. Permanent. That meant they couldn't undo it. The moment he signed that paper and had Janice print it for me, he'd created an event. Not a conversation, not a disagreement, a legal act. And in doing so, he'd activated clauses no one in his pay grade had jurisdiction to tamper with, let alone reverse. The system I'd helped build for operation stability, Darren had just walked face first into its legal twin, a compliance framework designed to prevent impulsive leadership from torching the infrastructure. Now, he was trapped inside it. The calls kept coming, a few from HR, one from his assistant, Janice, sounding more nervous than usual, another from some mid-level project manager I hadn't spoken to in months, testing the waters. Hey, if you're talking to leadership again, let me know. People are nervous. I didn't answer any of them. What was there to say? They made a move. I documented it. Legal did the rest. At 3:08 p.m., I sent one email, short, clean, no emotion, to corplegal@stratonal.com. Subject: Termination confirmation. Schedule D compliance attached. Darren signed termination letter. Timestamped, dated, verified. Body: Per our conversation and confirmation under Clause 19C, please find the final termination documentation as executed. No action required on my part unless otherwise directed. Thank you, Julia Carrington. No sign-off, flourish. No smiley, just clarity. And that was the final nail. The difference between panic and control isn't noise, it's documentation. He could spin all he wanted, reframe, posture, but the system didn't care about his tone. It cared about what he signed, and when. And the timestamp on that form, it didn't say confusion. It said, Friday, 8:12 a.m., which meant Darren Huxley, interim director, terminated an operations lead under interim authority, without cause, while the actual COO was still abroad, and tried to patch it with a voicemail and a made-up title after legal had already flagged it as unrecoverable. All I had to do was stay quiet. He was doing the rest himself. The email from legal was longer than the first one, but quieter in tone, like they understood exactly what had happened and were trying not to draw attention to the scale of it. Following your termination under interim authority, it read, please be advised the following provisions of Schedule D are now active and enforceable. Documentation of compliance and transfer will follow under separate cover. I scrolled down, then paused. There it was. Subsection 19C IV, Accelerated Equity Vesting, Project Atlas. My heart thudded once in my chest, not fast, just heavier. Project Atlas had been my life's work in code, a secure military-grade communications framework built after the 2024 supply chain breach nearly knocked out federal response systems. It had taken me 2 years to stabilize the infrastructure and another to layer in predictive routing based on real-time load balancing. When Calvin realized how integral the system would become, he carved out a special equity pool tied to Atlas contributions, deep vesting, 3-year cliff. The trigger? Separation without cause during hostile reorganization or interim mismanagement. In other words, exactly what Darren had done. My options had been frozen in year 2, not worthless, just distant, something I'd planned to watch slowly mature like savings bonds. Now they were liquid, fully vested, immediate. The attached valuation summary was surreal. Numbers don't lie. They just don't laugh either. By Monday afternoon, I had enough leverage to walk away from Stratonell and never work again if I wanted. But that wasn't the real win. The real win came in the next clause. Subsection 19CV, non-compete exemption clause. I read it twice. Any binding non-compete agreement established under previous employment terms would be nullified in the event of wrongful separation during interim restructuring. Darren hadn't just booted me out of the company, he'd freed me from every chain they thought I still wore. No 12-month waiting period, no radius clause, no sunset on federal sector bidding eligibility. I could walk into any agency, any contractor, any secure infrastructure consultancy tomorrow and name my price. Because thanks to Atlas, and thanks to the airtight record of his decision, my value had just moved from senior systems lead to architect of untouchable federal backbone tech with full IP independence. Darren had handed me my exit strategy, wrapped it in red tape, and personally dropped it at my doorstep with a signature and timestamp. He probably thought he was erasing a name from the org chart. What he'd done was sign off on a structural reshuffle that unlocked every asset I had tied to the company, the kind of legal and financial freedom that took most executives 2 decades to negotiate, and he gave it away like it was a parking violation. I didn't call Calvin, didn't gloat, didn't even forward the email to HR. I just opened my project archive, renamed the final version of my Atlas documentation to retained version private use, zipped it with the legal exemption attached, and filed it in a folder marked Post-Stratonell Active Assets. Then I leaned back, finished my coffee, and finally closed every company dashboard window one by one, not with bitterness, with clarity. They had no idea what I'd built under them. But now, for the first time, I was free to show everyone else. I waited until Tuesday morning to send the memo, not because I needed time. Everything was already documented, organized, watermarked, and backed up in 3 redundant locations. I waited because timing matters. You don't send shockwaves when everyone's still gasping from the first impact. You wait for the silence, then drop your final line like a depth charge. The subject line was plain. Clause 19C, final confirmation. It went to Claudia Reams, board liaison, and the only person in the upper chain who ever responded like a human being. I kept it short. Clinical. As per Clause 19C, retention and equity terms have been acknowledged. Legal confirmed activation of Schedule D as it pertains to my termination under interim authority. All documentation received. No further communication required unless initiated on your end. Then I attached it. Darren's form. The original termination letter he'd handed me, his signature, the timestamp, 8:12 a.m. Friday. I'd scanned it, annotated it, and embedded metadata that made it legally indisputable. The entire document was now part of their compliance archive. They couldn't delete it, couldn't edit it, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I didn't ask for reinstatement, didn't hint at grievances, didn't even include a final thank you. I hit send and walked away from the laptop like I'd just shut a vault door. No reply from Darren, none expected. His Slack account was still technically active, but I knew he wouldn't message. He'd gone silent the moment legal responded to my confirmation. I imagine he was in damage control mode, scrambling through email threads, checking HR logs, trying to find some procedural loophole to argue this had all been a misunderstanding. But the document didn't care about misunderstandings. It only cared about the act, the execution, the signature. At 1:43 p.m., my phone rang. Not a number I recognized, but I picked up anyway. "Julia," Calvin said. His voice was even, but strained. He was temporary. We didn't expect this level of arrogance. I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the quiet neighborhood I never got to enjoy during work hours. "I'm not angry," I said. "Just leaving clean." He sighed. Not like he was tired, more like he finally understood the scale of what had just happened. "You could come back. We'd find a way, once the dust settles." "I know," I said. I didn't say yes, didn't say no. Just let him sit with the reality that this wasn't about negotiation anymore. They hadn't just lost an operator. They'd triggered the full release of someone who knew every inch of their infrastructure and now owned none of their limitations. When we hung up, I filed the call summary into my notes, labeled "Final Acknowledgement, Senior Leadership," and then I turned off all my work devices. Phone, laptop, backup access key. The last thing I did was unplug the air-gapped drive that held the final snapshot of the Atlas build. Not out of paranoia, just habit. Everything was recorded, and now it all belonged to me. 2 months is nothing in government time, but in corporate exile, it's enough to watch the dust settle and see who crawls out. Grey Corps moved fast. They'd been circling for a while, sniffing around my old work on Atlas. Once news of my release from Stratonel made the industry rounds, and it did, these circles are smaller than they look, I had 3 proposals in my inbox before the week was out. Only one of them opened with, "We've followed your work since your early designs on ArcNode 2. So that's where I went. Director of Defense Systems wasn't just a title. It came with access, input, weight, the kind of weight that makes people sit up when you speak, even if they outrank you on paper. Especially in briefing rooms like the one I walked into that morning in DC. High ceiling, low light, and enough polished brass in the chairs to fund a minor war. I recognized Darren the moment I entered. Same slouch, same cologne, same haircut, like he still thought he was in marketing. He was seated at the far end of the table, name placard awkwardly taped over with the logo of some boutique consultancy I'd never heard of. From the look on his face, I could tell he hadn't expected to see me either. His jaw tensed. He didn't look up. The meeting was a procurement scoping session. Early stage, no contracts yet, just capability briefs and preliminary Q&A. Grey Corps' prototype wasn't ready for show, but that didn't matter. They wanted our brain in the room more than our product. Darren, on the other hand, was there to pitch. He had slides, acronyms, buzzwords like modular redundancy and seamless post-contingency pivoting, all very polished, all very empty. He fumbled through some vague narrative about hybrid deployments and passive node recovery. It was clear he'd cherry-picked leftover ideas from Atlas, without the scaffolding to make them work. His diagrams looked like someone tried to copy a blueprint by memory. And then came the question that landed squarely in the space between us. A senior analyst from the Defense Acquisition Corps raised her hand, eyes scanning both ends of the table. How do each of your teams address protocol resilience during leadership transitions, especially in systems requiring operational integrity under executive flux? Translation. What happens when someone like Darren gets put in charge again? He froze. I didn't. I folded my hands neatly, waited a breath, and then answered. Clear, calm, direct. Any system that depends on personality instead of structure will always collapse. Resilience is designed, not hoped for. It's built into architecture, into documentation, into escalation protocols. If a transition destabilizes operations, the fault isn't the leader, it's the lack of blueprint. No one spoke for a second. Then the woman who asked nodded once and scribbled something down. Across from me, Darren shifted in his seat. Still no eye contact. Just the slow dawning that the room he thought he could dominate was now reading from a different script. And I'd written it. No one asked him to respond. No one needed to. I wasn't back in that room to win a pissing match. I wasn't back to gloat. I was there because I'd survived the collapse of a system designed around ego and walked out carrying the parts that still worked. Now, they listened when I spoke. Not because of a title, but because when everything else had broken, my structure hadn't. It didn't make headlines. There was no public statement, no PR cleanup, just a quiet footnote buried deep in Stratonel's quarterly report. Sunsetting of internal comms platform, Project Atlas, transition to third-party solutions pending. No fanfare, no credit, no mention of the fact that the backbone of Atlas had been hollowed out the second they let me walk. With every contingency, every protocol escalation path, every adaptive layer carefully designed to function only under authenticated continuity. And I'd been the continuity. They tried patching it, I heard. Brought in a couple of ex-DoD contractors to do resilience mapping, but without access to the secure keychain lineage and signal testbed documentation, both of which were IP protected under Schedule D. They were chasing ghosts in a maze only I could solve. By then, it didn't matter. My equity had cleared, fully paid out. No disputes, no delays. Legal didn't even try to argue the value. They knew it was airtight. The deposit landed in full. I never replied to the transfer notice. I just moved the funds, logged the transaction in my ledger, and flagged the clause that made it happen as exercised final. The only thing left behind was my name. Still embedded in the federal architecture blueprint. Not buried, referenced. 3 separate bids submitted to the Procurement Oversight Board included direct credit citations to the Atlas framework. All 3 advanced to final selection. None of them involved Darren. Last I checked, he was still trying to land subcontracts through a shell firm registered out of Wyoming. No staff, no patents, just recycled language and recycled failure. One of his decks leaked. Someone forwarded it to a contact of mine. It had a diagram lifted straight from Atlas Phase 1. Funny thing, it didn't work without the sublayer triggers I'd never published. And never would. I didn't retaliate, never posted a word, never so much as hinted at what really happened. No LinkedIn manifesto, no carefully curated next chapter selfie, just silence. Because I didn't need to drag anyone through the mud. I didn't need to prove what I'd built. It stood on its own. And when the storm came, it held. While everything else fractured, egos, org charts, interim titles, my structure stayed locked, documented, verified, untouched. Calvin never reached out again, neither did Claudia. But I noticed a line in their compliance update months later, buried deep in Appendix F. No unilateral terminations shall occur under interim leadership without external legal review and board vote. Took a mistake to write that rule. Took me to show them why it mattered. Now, I work quiet, build smarter, consult selectively. Every clause I draft carries the memory of that moment, when they triggered their own unraveling, thinking they were cutting fat. They didn't know what I owned, not until it activated, not until it was too late. And by then, legacy had already locked.